Hello, my name is Jennifer Wilson and I'm with the Gulfport School District, and today we are going to be talking about Standard RI 4.3, which is explaining events in a historical text, and I'm also including Standard RI 4.7, which is interpreting information in an informational text. Alright, so let's look at our passage. Alright, so what we see here is we see a passage about Thomas Jefferson. Okay, so this is a historical text. It's actually talking about somebody, so it's also a biography if we're talking about the genre. But I see a lot of information on this page. I see the title of my passage, which is A Great Man Who Wore Many Hats. I see a picture of Thomas Jefferson. But I also see two things that are very interesting, and this is what sets informational text apart from your fictional text. I see something like a timeline. And all a timeline is just facts put in chronological order or sequential order. And then I also see something out to the right, which is just a text feature, which is it's a text box. And what that is it gives us additional information that may not be included in the passage, but it's just as important as the passage itself. Alright, so the very first thing I like to do is I like to look through my passage first. So I'm looking at my 3 paragraphs and seeing what I'm reading about. Alright, so the title is A Great Man Who Wore Many Hats. Thomas Jefferson was born in Virginia in 1743. He would grow to be a man of many accomplishments. Jefferson would write books, design buildings, play music, and invent machinery. He would become a lawyer, a farmer, a scientist, and the 3rd president of the United States. As a young man, Jefferson learned to speak 4 languages and read 2 more. He started college when he was only 16. Later, he studied law. In 1801, Thomas Jefferson became the 3rd president of the United States. He served 2 terms as president. One of his many accomplishments was the Louisiana Purchase. The U.S. bought the Louisiana Territory from France. This extended the border of the United States and made the country larger. Alright, so in our passage we see when he was born, where he was born, some of the things that were important during his lifetime, and we also have some dates. But we don't have all the dates. So when they're talking about some of the things that he's done, we can actually look back and see in the timeline. So let's take a look at the timeline and see. Okay, so we see at 1743 is when he was born in Virginia. But it talked about him going off to college when he was 16. So when was that? So we see that he started college in 1760 to 1762. Okay, so that's important to Thomas Jefferson when we're talking about his accomplishments. Okay, but in 1767, we find out that that's when he began to practice law. And then in 1772, we see who he married. He married Martha Skelton. And then in 1776, Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence. Okay, even if you don't know who Thomas Jefferson is, you're probably familiar with the Declaration of Independence, but it talks about in the passage what are some of his accomplishments, but that's one of his major ones that is included in the timeline, but we didn't necessarily include it in the passage. Okay, so we see in the passage it says in 1801 that he served as the 3rd president. But how did he even get to be president? So that's something we could go back and look at in our timeline to see how he went from being a law student to being president of the United States. So then we see in 1779 to 1781, he served as the governor of Virginia. And then in 1790 to 1793, he served as the U.S. Secretary of State. And then in 1797 to 1801, he served as the Vice President of the United States. So in 1801 to 1809, that is when he served his 2 terms as president. And we see that in the passage. Okay, then it talks about the Louisiana Purchase. So in 1803 is when he buys the Louisiana Territory from France. So that was one of his many accomplishments that we see in the timeline and also in the passage. Okay, one thing it doesn't include is when he passed away. That is included in our timeline, and we see that in 1826, that is when Thomas Jefferson died. All right, so the next thing is we see in our text box, and a lot of times it's just your interesting facts, some things you would like to read about him that you may not know about. That's why it's titled Interesting Jefferson Facts. So we have that during the War of 1812, the Library of Congress was destroyed, and Jefferson gave more than 6,000 of his own books to help restock it. So that kind of lets you know what kind of person Thomas Jefferson is. Okay, the next one, Jefferson loved the sound of mockingbirds. He kept a pet mockingbird at the White House. So that's just a little interesting fact about him and what kind of pets that he liked. And then the last one, Jefferson invented many useful things. These included a code wheel, a type of plow, and a movable office chair. He also invented a copying press he could use while traveling. He even invented automatic double doors. All right, so in the passage, it talked about him being an inventor. He did a lot of things, that he liked to build a lot of things. That gave us a lot of examples of things that we even use today. So that makes it a little bit more interesting about all the things that he made. All right, so with the historical text, now we're trying to explain the facts that we see. We're reading for information and just those basic comprehension questions. All right, so we have 5 questions, so it's real quick and simple. But let's look at question number 1. The author probably chose the passage title because Jefferson. Okay, Jefferson did what? All right, so when we're talking about the passage title, I need to go back to the title of what I just read. And I read A Great Man Who Wore Many Hats. Okay, so let's look at our options. Jefferson liked to wear hats when he traveled. He had many kinds of accomplishments. He served as President of the United States. And he wrote the Declaration of Independence. All right, I'm going to change my slide. All right, so when I talk about him wearing many hats, am I talking about how he liked to wear different hats, like baseball hats, formal dinner hats? No, I'm talking about something that is about his character. What that passage title is just a figure of speech. But what the answer really is, he probably chose it to talk about the many kinds of accomplishments, that he did a lot of things. He was an inventor. He served public office. He graduated from college at a very young age. He went to law school. So that's just talking about his many accomplishments that he had during his lifetime. All right, look at question number 2. Which of these events happened first? Now, one thing that I like to do is I like to look through my different options. And I like to take that information and try to put the date out to the side so I can then go back and put them in order. So let's look and see. All right, so we have Jefferson becomes U.S. President. The Louisiana Territory was purchased from France. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson served as the governor of Virginia. All right, so I go back and look at number 1. Jefferson became the U.S. President. With that, I can go back to the passage, and I see that in 1801 was when he served as president. And I also see it in my timeline. So out to the side, I could just write 1801 is the year when that happened. Okay, then we have the Louisiana Territory was purchased from France. Now, I don't see it in my passage, the date. I see that it happened, but I have to go back to my timeline, and I see that that happened in 1803. So I would write 1803 out to the side. Then I have Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. All right, so I need to go back up to my timeline because I don't see it in the passage. So it's got to be somewhere in there. And I go and I see that in 1776 is when that happened. So then I would write out to the side 1776. Okay, and then the last one, Jefferson served as the governor of Virginia. Okay, now I did not see it in the passage, but I did see it in the timeline. So now I need to go up there and try to find it. So I see that in 1779 through 1781 was when he served as governor. Now I need to figure out which of these events happened first. And I found it right here. In 1776, Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence. So our answer would be C. That's what happened first in 1776. All right, number 3. When did Thomas Jefferson die? Now, I talked about it earlier. I did not see it in the passage, but I did find it in the timeline. So I found it here that in 1826 is when he passed away. So I would choose the year 1826 as my answer. All right, number 4. During which years did Jefferson serve as U.S. president? Now, I know when he became president in 1801 because I see that in the passage and I see that he served 2 terms, but I need to go up to the timeline to figure out how long that lasted. So then I would go up to my timeline and I see 1801 and it lasted from 1801 to 1809. So he served as president. That answer would be A, 1801 to 1809. All right, number 5. I like to include a written response because I like to see what you can write or how you can explain what you've just read. All right, so let's look at our question. Explain how the timeline helps you understand information in the passage. All right, so we talked about the passage and we talked about how that timeline helps us. And we also had to use that timeline to answer some of these questions. So let's talk about how it helped us understand the information. Okay, so you can talk about it amongst yourselves or you can just write something quick down. But I have written it down, so I want to show you how I answered this particular question. All right, so I said the timeline helps the reader to place the events from the passage in order, and it gives the reader a clear picture of Jefferson's major life events. Now, when you see how I answered that question, is all I did was restate what they wanted me to do. So that's something we call the race strategy. So it said, explain how the timeline helps you. So all I did was say that the timeline helps the reader, and then I gave examples. Okay, so I said the timeline helps the reader to place the events from the passage in order, because we talked about that chronological or sequential order. It helps put it in that order. And then also it gives the reader a clear picture of Jefferson's major life events. So we didn't see it necessarily in the passage. We knew some of the things that he had done, but we didn't know when he accomplished all of that and how long it took him to accomplish it. So that's something that helped us. So again, using the race strategy will help you answer those questions. And also, you notice I wrote it in the complete sentence. Make sure you do that. All right, so I gave you an example today, and this is what we looked at, is how to read a historical text, which is an informational text, and then also how to use something like a timeline to interpret information. So we combine the two standards. So hopefully whenever you see an informational text, you will look for these things. You will look for the timeline, or if you have something like a graph or a chart, and then out to the side you might see something that's like a text box that gives you those extra information that you see in an informational text. Thank you.